Hi, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for your next PB&J card class. And in today's video, I will be creating this nearly one-layer card featuring our slapstick cling stamp called Floral Medley. I just love this beautiful florals and outline image. And real quick before we begin, here is a look at all the supplies I'll be using in creating this card. And I will put this back up on screen at the very end of the video, so if you want to look at it in more detail, you can just hit pause when it pops back up at the end of the video. So to begin, I am stamping onto Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and I'm using Versamark ink. I did rub an anti-static bag over the top of my paper, and because I'm going to be doing some embossing, and that anti-static bag will just help the embossing powder only stick where I've stamped and not stick anywhere else. So because there is so much detail to this stamp, I am going to stamp it a couple of times with that Versamark ink, just so I'm sure that I am capturing all of the detail before I add the embossing powder. And I'm going to emboss this with white embossing powder, so I'm just going to sprinkle that on, and then I'll use my heat tool to set it. And then off camera I did add just a little touch of more stamping in the bottom right hand corner, and I also embossed that in white. So to color this in, I'm going to be using a mix of Memento markers and Tombow dual brush pens. They're both a water soluble marker, so the embossing that I've done will resist that ink and remain white even when I'm coloring right over the top of it with this marker. I'm starting with the Angel Pink Memento marker, and then I'm going to right on top, while it's still kind of wet, I'm going to add the Lilac Posies Memento marker. And I'm just kind of adding some stylized lines where I would like it to appear a little bit darker. Now I will go back over the top while it is still fairly wet and blend that just a touch with the Angel Pink. Now, because I'm working on watercolor paper, this is not going to completely blend. It's not going to look like a Copic marker, but that was the look I was going for. I wanted it to have kind of a stylized shading where you still see some of the line of the shading. Now, if you wanted it to be blended more, you could blend it, go in there with a water brush, or just a paintbrush with water and blend it. You could also paint these in with watercolors if you wanted sort of a softer look to the shading, but I think this is really dynamic when combined with the embossing. So you get these really rich dark colors and stylized shading with that thin white line from the embossing. Now I do work just a couple of petals at a time, and that does help it blend a little bit more for you because it doesn't have time to completely dry. I'm just going in and continuing to blend that as I go. Now the reason I'm using a combination of the Tombow dual brush pens and the Memento markers is just color choice. There was a couple of blues that I didn't have in the Memento markers, and I preferred the dual brush pens for that specific color, so that's why I grabbed those. But this would also work really well with any of your other water soluble markers. I don't have the zig markers, but I think that would also work great with this for this technique, as would distress markers too. They all vary a little bit in intensity and your different color choices, so you can mix and match them, but whatever you have on hand works pretty well for this technique as long as it's water soluble, so it won't be permanent on top of those embossed lines. Now this is a pretty busy stamp, so there's a lot of detail to it, but because there's not a lot of shading and it's just basically coloring and then adding just one line of shading, it really moves pretty quickly to color in, and it's just so fun to see it start to come to life with those white outlines. For these blue flowers, I'm just doing a light blue and adding a little touch of turquoise on top, and just going back over with that light blue pen and blending it a little bit. So I continued with that process to color in the entire image. So I did show you on camera there one of each color, one of each style of flower, and I just did that for the entire image. And now I just added a little bit of Mermaid Lagoon Distress Ink Reinker to a palette. I added some water because it is very concentrated as a reinker. And I'm just going to use that to paint my background. And you could also, again, just use a watercolor. You could put your Distress Ink right onto a palette, press the pad on there and add water to mix it up. I just have the reinkers on hand and do a lot of painting with them, so that's why I chose that. I also wanted to be sure to add this blue background painting because the white outline is on a white background, and I wanted to be sure that that outer outline of all of the flowers showed up too. So by putting that blue paint in there, then you can see the outline of the rest of the image. I hope that makes sense as you're watching it come together, but I just felt like it finished things off a lot more. I'm using a lot of water to blend that so it sort of fades from the darker blue closest to the flowers to a white as it moves away from the flowers. And I'll do that up here on the very top as well. And I'll just continue painting that until it's done following those same techniques. So now I'm ready to work on the sentiment portion of my card, and I'm combining one of the sentiments from our friendship flower sets with the new creative die set Bloom Magical. I'll be using the word bloom. I die cut the top layer of this from Nina Solar White cardstock, and I am adding Bahama Blue, and then I'll add Teal Zeal Memento inks on top, just using a sponge applicator tool and pouncing it on top of the die. I was looking for something that tied into the background painting that I had done, but was quite a bit darker. And this is the same die cut from a thicker Canson 140-pound watercolor paper. And I just chose watercolor paper because it was thicker. And I'm going to glue this other one right on top, and this just gives some more thickness and dimension to that die cut. It just really looks nice and professional when you add that to the card. Now for my sentiment, I did just cut apart the sentiment so that it only has the words "where you are planted," and I am going to stamp that with the archival ink, the color of watering can. I like this because it is dark, but it's not totally black, so it doesn't overtake or distract from the rest of the stamping and coloring. And I did that in my Misty Stamp Positioning tool so I could build up the color, and also because the watercolor paper has a little bit of texture to it, so that helped ensure that I got a nice impression. And the last thing to do here is to just glue this die cut sentiment down right above the stamped sentiment. And this nearly one layer card is done. This panel, all I need to do is mount it to a standard size 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 note card. And here's a look at that finished card. I thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, Twitter, on our website and our blog, and I'll be sure to link to all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And stay tuned, and that complete supply list will be popping up on screen here in just a second.